This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. What do you guys want to talk about?
I know we have to talk about eventually. No, I'm not particularly looking forward to it. It wasn't as bad as last week, but... well, to tell you the truth, I could probably cut and paste a lot of what I said about Dynamite last week. It is a 2-hour television program with a bunch of random crap happening for seemingly no reason. The week-to-week booking is completely unfathomable. And whereas 2 years ago, I would probably be asking questions like, why is this happening? Why is that happening? Now I just go, well, that was stupid. Or, well, that was pointless. Or in the case of this week's show, why is the firm a thing again? Oh, wait a minute, that's right. I don't care. And neither does anybody else for that matter. And I've got other issues with this episode that go beyond whatever's going on with MJF and the firm. But before we dive into AEW logistics, let's try and stall for time as much as we can here. Delay the inevitable, so to speak. This is the Five Starr Wrestling Report. If you are a new or returning viewer, welcome. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, like the show, leave a comment, and whatever other functions are on YouTube at this point. Or Rumble, because we are also on Rumble each week as well. Obviously, if you've watched before, you know what's on the docket today. We're going to run through the shambles of this AEW television show and then try and move on with the stuff that's actually worth talking about, seeing as how the retro content is actually, logical. Now, it's like I said at the beginning, man. I could really copy and paste a lot of what I said last week when it comes to AEW and put it here. This was another show where a bunch of stuff happened. MJF had a quick, solid promo segment where he did the best Jon Moxley impression I've ever seen, which was a highlight. And, well, I think looking back, I pretty much checked out after hour one. Somehow I was able to sleepwalk through watching a Bryan Danielson match. And a year ago, I never thought I'd actually be saying that about a Bryan Danielson match, but, well, here we are, unfortunately, in 2022, where everything they have done with Danielson's booking from the time he's shown up to where we are now has been, I don't even know if atrocious is a harsh enough term to use. It is reprehensible with what they have done with Bryan Danielson in the last 12 months. One of the hottest acts in this company a little over a year ago at this point. And now here he is in 2022 having a top-of-the-hour TV match against another one of AEW's interchangeable vanilla flippy midgets with no personality. More examples of putting guys on television that couldn't draw money if you dipped them in glue and threw them into a money vault. And I'll talk a little later on about what kind of ran me off after hour one. Not that anything offensive really came up during that time. I had just pretty much seen everything that I needed to and skipped to the very last few minutes of the show when MJF came back out. But I did see virtually everything that happened in hour one. And, well, that was quite the acid trip. The Chris Jericho, Daniel Garcia versus Wheeler Yuta, Claudio Castagnoli match was a clear-cut example of Jericho ensuring that he's getting the most out of milking Tony Khan for more money over the next 3 years, or however long that contract extension is good for. I mean, the finishing was at least fitting, although I don't know how much Claudio winning at this stage really means. If he was being booked consistently by a guy with a clue, then I'd probably be more optimistic about it. But Claudio is another textbook example of a guy that Tony Khan signed without having any idea of what he wanted to do with him creatively. So, of course, he shows up to get the big pop, has 1 or 2 TV squash matches to give him a win. They give him the Ring of Honor World title very briefly for about a month. He does jack squat with it. And now he's a bit player in one of AEW's 82 ongoing factions, all of which are completely meaningless and serve no purpose. I mean, Claudio was obviously the best worker in the match. And the last few minutes where Claudio ran wild on the heels and was able to give Jericho the swing while carrying Daniel Garcia on his shoulders, that was sweet. You know, the deal where he ended up pretty much laying out every single member of the Jagoff Asshole Society and getting the pin on Jericho. Again, it was the right call for a finish. The problem is that they never should have taken the ROH World title off of Claudio in the first place. It was a total asinine move to put the belt on Jericho when it made absolutely no sense to do it. And it's like, okay, so Claudio got a win on Jericho. So what? Is he going to get a rematch only to lose to Jericho again? Because they're still doing this retarded story where Jericho is going to plow through a bunch of former ROH World Champions, which will do nothing for AEW's overall bottom line except stroke Jericho's ego. God, with the amount of blowjobs that guy's giving Tony right now, you ought to be careful he doesn't get gonorrhea. As for the rest of the match, I kind of spaced out from time to time. You know, since I spent a minute putting Claudio over, I guess I can throw in one of my nitpicky things here. Something Claudio did that I didn't like. You know, when he came firing out of the gates with those fake-looking uppercut shots to Jericho, that shit was awful. You know, probably didn't help that Jericho sold it flatter than a plate full of piss, but still. You know, it's the same thing I talk about when Eddie Kingston used to do those stupid machine gun chops in the corner that looked phony as all get out. You know, Claudio essentially doing the same thing with the rapid-fire uppercuts that look like they're barely connecting most of the time. That just looks dumb. Wish he wouldn't do that. I'm also yet to understand what is so special about Daniel Garcia or Wheeler Yuta, or what Tony sees in these guys beyond generic spot monkey number 348 and 349. I mean, I won't deny that people got behind Yuta when he came out. Of all places for Yuta to get massively over in, Norfolk, Virginia of all places. Isn't he from Philly? No. In any case, it's like I say every time I see Garcia or Yuta in the ring. Fine athletes, probably guys that I would use as underneath talent for a period until they're a little more experienced and ready to be elevated or pushed to a different spot on the card, if I see potential in them, which I don't. In Tony Khan's case, it's, I'm on a mission to prove that I can develop homegrown talent, without actually taking into account the key word there, talent. Hence, these guys are constantly forced down our throats on TV every single week, even though it's clearly reflective in the ratings that these guys are not doing anything to increase the numbers or viewers for the show every week. But, you know, it's a conversation no one wants to have because everyone has their blinders on, and the only thing they see is building homegrown talent. That's all that matters. They just don't want to analyze the fact that Garcia and Yuta do absolutely nothing for AEW's overall bottom line, and probably never will. Speaking of not doing anything for AEW's overall bottom line, at least with how badly they've neutered him in the last year, Bryan Danielson was in the back with Renee to do a promo, and they're talking about how Danielson is coming off 2 consecutive losses, trying to analyze how he's going to bounce back from said losses, which is criminal that we're even having that conversation right now, talking about Bryan Danielson dropping 2 straight falls in a row. And at the point, Yuta and Claudio came in and everyone started yelling at one another. I kind of mentally checked out from this thing. In addition to Flat Wheel Yuta being completely inept in the personality department, he also still can't cut a convincible promo to save his life. But I think we've already established that. That was followed with a quick vignette showing the Elite on camera in their various awkward-looking poses. And it's showing them holding up belts while they all disappear from the frames in these weird vapor-looking animations. I wish this was a pre-tape to indicate that the Elite have been vaporized from the company altogether. Unfortunately, this just appears to be a sign that they're going to be back soon. Well, on the positive side, at least it'll be more material for me to skip over. And by the way, I have not neglected the Punk stuff yet. I'm sort of waiting in the periphery to talk about that one. At least until we get some further clarity on where his future actually lies. But, yeah, the Beta Bucks and Kenny Omega thing, I guess they're going to be back on TV soon. Okay. And if they come back and they want to kickstart their little Playmate session with the 6-man toy belts, good on them. They can fucking have those meaningless belts and feud with all the other collective wastes of space that are part of that Trios division. Then we had some audio glitch issues with the Jagoff Asshole Society in the back, because this company's Bush League and still can't figure out how to get proper tech equipment to film their shit, even though the owner's a billionaire. Boy, what company does that sound like? And then we had the point in the show where the reality kind of hit that Tony's completely given up on FTR because they wrestled Swerve Strickland and Limited Keith Lee, the number one contenders match to the AEW tag titles. And I should first point out that FTR got one of the biggest babyface ovations at this point in the show, and that might have been a cognitive tactic on Tony's part to make sure he cut those guys off at the knees, because as soon as FTR came down, whose music should hit but the Acclaimed? And those guys got an even bigger ovation than FTR did, unfortunately. Probably just to spite Cash and Dax, because you know Tony's got the Beta Bucks in his ear, encouraging Tony to do everything in his power to hold FTR back. And boy, was that ever apparent by the end of this thing. And I'll say this about the match before we even get to the finish. You know, FTR are not going to have a bad match. On their worst day, they're still hands down the best tag team in the business today. Swerve in Our Glory, while I still think it's one of the dumbest names for a tag team I've ever heard, it's the most productive thing AEW's done with either guy. I have my own personal issues with the booking of their team. They've been doing this subtle story of them not getting along, but then they end up getting along in the end, but it's kind of a gray area where they have some miscommunication at times, but it never leads to anything. I don't know. It's at the point now where you're expecting them to break up at some point, and it's like, how excited can you really be for that? You know, especially when your tag division is already in the doldrums to begin with. Is it really a wise move to be teasing a breakup with one of your more established tag teams, regardless of what I think of them? Generally, I think Swerve and Keith still wrestle their matches, too much of an indie mentality, too much inconsistency with tags coming in and out of the ring illegally. I'm not a big fan of a lot of their double team moves, especially the ones where it looks like they're really overly convoluted. It takes them like 30 seconds to set them up half the time. But, you know, Cash and Dax are so fluid with everything they do. All their shit looks great. They're always in the right spot. Everything looks flawless. I love the spot toward the end here where Swerve was trying to give Harwood a head scissor deal from the top rope, and Dax caught Swerve in a powerbomb position pretty much effortlessly. I wrote down, that was one of the greatest catches I've ever seen in a wrestling match, because Swerve was not coming off the ropes when Dax caught him. Like, Dax caught Swerve when he was flying in the air off the top rope. That was not an easy catch, but Dax made it look easy, and, you know, that guy's had a series of some injury issues before. I think he had a bum shoulder, and he's still got that knee brace on, so he's been down a rough road before, but God, that guy's such a good worker. There was a weird spot where Dax and Cash tried to do the combination superplex splash deal to Keith, and instead of Keith taking a flat back bump so Cash could hit him with the splash, Keith ended up rolling over to his side. So when Cash came down, he basically landed on Keith's arm and shoulder. That didn't look like a fun landing. That was probably more on Keith for trying to turn over when he didn't need to. But at the end of the day, the finish is what we're all going to remember about it. And once again, you can tell who's influencing Tony's booking decisions when it comes to who gets spotlighted in the tag division. FTR, the best goddamn team they've got under contract right now. They're tag champions in every other meaningless promotion out there, except for the one they're fucking signed to. So, of course, they do the job in the end. All because the Guns held Cash back on the floor and prevented him from making the save after Keith hit Dax with a Big Bang catastrophe. I mean, I guess to be fair, I wasn't all that big a fan of seeing FTR versus the Acclaimed right now, especially when both teams are over as babyfaces. It's probably not a good idea to split the crowd between the two teams when you don't really need to go there right now. Keith and Swerve have history with the Acclaimed. There's story implication to do the rubber match. The match they had at the All Out pay-per-view was really damn good, minus the wrong finish. The match where the Acclaimed actually won the belts on TV wasn't as good because, they had the match on TV, didn't have a whole lot of time. There were about 72 commercial breaks during it that kind of detracted from the match. So, I understand why they went with the finish they did here, but I mean, what is there to say when it comes to FTR at this point? More wasted opportunities when it comes to the way Tony follows up with guys that are naturally over with the crowd. Those fantastic matches they had with the Briscoes this year, the second match with the Bucks where FTR went over clean. Could have easily set up a deal where FTR and the Bucks go to that third match at the All Out show for the AEW tag titles. Before the Bucks drop the belts to Keith and Swerve in a match on television, where if memory serves me right, they didn't even do the fucking job in that match. And not only did we not get FTR versus the Bucks 3 when there was an actual story reason to do it, but then FTR completely fell to the back burner while the Bucks went on their merry way and started wrestling for another set of meaningless belts that nobody cares about. It's almost like the Booker of the Year isn't such a great booker after all. Or maybe I'm just an old man yelling at the clouds for no reason. What do I know? Then we had a comedic segment in the back with Renee Paquette, Britt Baker, and Saraya, where Saraya and Britt began screaming at one another like catty, annoying bitches. Also, Renee could say, "Guys, if you want to talk to each other, we'll do it professionally." And so what do? They cut away. Fucking fantastic. Guess it was more important for Renee to teleport out to the arena so she could do this MJF interview, which I know will be shocking to hear, but this was 1,000 times better than listening to Britt and Saraya bicker. And of course, Max comes out and the people all go nuts for him, but MJF is smart, so he's making sure to play up the wise-ass heel remarks, being sure to denigrate the Norfolk fans whenever he got the chance. We actually had some good lines in here with Renee, too. I love the deal where Renee's telling him, "Max, you can't start a phrase with all due respect and then try to follow it with something insulting." And then Max immediately retorts with, "Renee, all due respect, shut your mouth." And everyone goes ballistic for that. What a mic drop. We already touched on this deal earlier, how MJF did one of the best Moxley impressions I've ever seen. Totally out of the playbook of how Jim Cornette and Brian Last make fun of him when they do their AEW reviews. Max doing the, "I'm going to break your bones, I'm going to drink your blood, and then I'm going to feast on your intestines." He's even got the walk down packed. Or as I commonly refer to it as, the Moxley Bebop. Anyway, the gist of this promo is that he vowed to beat Jon Moxley clean at the Full Gear pay-per-view, at least as clean as they could interpret that for an MJF match. He did promise that he was not going to use the Dynamite Diamond ring, and that was more so to prove to William Regal that he didn't need the ring to get the job done, just like when Regal claimed he didn't need to use brass knuckles to get the job done in his matches. And after he beats Mox for the world title, he's going to shove that win down everyone's throats. All the people that told Max for his entire life that he was never good enough, all the people that doubted his ability from day one, he's going to shove it down all their throats. And this was one of those circumstances where they could have easily wrapped it up here and it would have been absolutely perfect. Unfortunately, they had to throw in the Stokely Hathaway bit. And, it didn't totally ruin the segment, but didn't really do it any favors either. Basically, this whole exchange with MJF and Stokely was Max telling the firm that if they get involved with his business or try to lay out Moxley after his title defense later on, then MJF will personally fire Stokely. And of course, he pats Max on the shoulder and walks off so MJF can do his catchphrase deal. And, I'll cover what they ended up doing with that whole story later on. But as far as my stance on the whole firm thing, fuck it. I may as well just talk about it now since we're on it. Because I didn't watch the Jon Moxley Penta O Screwball title match or whatever Penta's name is now. I mean, he changes it every 2 fucking months. It's impossible to keep track at this point. But they wrestled, Moxley won, and then the Afterbirth saw everyone from the firm run out to lay out Moxley. And while they're putting the boots to him, who should then run out? Not Danielson, not Claudio, not Flatwheel Yuta. Nobody from the Blackpool Combat Club came out to help their fallen brother after he was being maimed by 5 dudes and a manager. I guess because they were all trapped behind a door with a chain wrapped around it. Somehow they were unable to hear the firm try to lock a chain around their locker room door. I don't know how that's humanly possible, but maybe they were all taking a nap. I don't know. But the man that ran out at the end was MJF, who was conflicted because he instinctually did not want to help Moxley, but he also made it patently clear earlier on that he wanted Mox 100% at the Full Gear pay-per-view, and he didn't want Stokely or anyone in the group to attack Mox to soften him up, which is hilarious if you think about it, because Moxley constantly looks like he just got run through a fucking razor blade factory most weeks. I mean, you couldn't run that guy over with an 18-wheel semi and kill him, much less being jumped by 5 dudes in a wrestling ring being enough to put him on the shelf. Regardless, MJF was pissed that Stokely tried to go around him when Max was paying him to begin with. So the firm ended up jumping Max and laying him out to close the show. And if you can get past the ridiculous visual of the 2 guys wrestling for the World fucking Championship at their next pay-per-view event, in the main event, by the way, if you can get past how stupid that whole thing was, it also demonstrates the biggest problem with this entire show this week. Who gives a fuck about the firm? And moreover, why would I care that they laid out MJF when they did virtually nothing to establish any kind of long-term business relationship between the 2 parties? How long has the firm been around? Maybe 2 months? Have they done anything with the group that you would consider constructive? Have they wrestled any matches as a group yet? And see, this is the problem when you got Mark Bookers that have no experience. They have no idea what they're doing when it tries to come up with booking this shit on a week-to-week basis. Never planning anything out in advance. Never having a full line of vision for where you want something or someone to go. You can argue long-term creative vision all you want with me, but I'm going to throw up the red flag on this one because all I need to do is mention the firm. That is end of sentence. MJF and Stokely were working together for all of 2 months before they finally turn on him. And in that time, did they do anything to really establish why we should care about that business relationship? No, of course not. They just threw a bunch of geeks into a faction for no reason, never gave him one single standout match or segment, never did anything to establish why MJF would be friends with them, and now they've already split from the guy overseeing the group before anyone ever had a chance to get over. Just more of the same when it comes to AEW. Nonsensical week-to-week booking where nothing makes sense and we're given no reason to care. And the sad thing is that this involves MJF, who is usually one of the best parts of the show most weeks. And again, going back to his promo, his initial promo was great. But you can go back and hear me talk about my thoughts on the whole association with the firm. I remember being pretty clear about this when I reviewed the All Out pay-per-view. I never really liked the idea from the jump, and now that we've seen it play out, now I think I'm kind of justified by thinking that this was a bad idea from the start. I never understood the working relationship to begin with, and since they gave me no reason to care between the time they introduced the group to where we are now you look back and you're like, what was the point? So minus the Stokely stuff, I like the direction they're taking MJF right now. He's not a babyface. You can tell something's brewing. And if that ultimately leads to William Regal turning on Moxley at the Full Gear show and aligning with MJF, I'm all for it. And the firm can go firmly piss off for all I care. Because no one cares about that group. And then we had the Bryan Danielson-Sammy Guevara match. By the way, going back to the firm thing real quick, if you actually do care about this group, you're lying. Just saying. So as I alluded to earlier on, this is sort of a heartbreaking eye-opener to see what has become of Danielson. A guy that actually could have been a major needle mover for this company. They'd have kept with him and pushed him as the heel world champion for a while. Instead, they insisted on keeping the belt on Adam Page, and well, now Danielson's in the position he's in now. Just another guy on the roster having matches here and there. None of it really matters. It's not really doing anything for AEW's numbers because now people have finally caught on to the reality that Danielson is just a bit player in AEW now. They know he's not going to be champion. They know he's not really going to be involved with anything all that interesting anymore. So now people have stopped caring. You know, they might still stick around to watch him wrestle, but they're not going to go out of their way to tune in to see him like they would have maybe a year or so ago when he was white hot showing up. And again, this is what AEW does. They bring in guys with all this hype. They get a huge ovation when they first arrive. And then everything that happens after the fact is usually a disappointment. Fire off every name that has jumped ship from WWE to AEW in the last 2.5 years. Tell me when I'm lying. Please. You know, and no offense to Sammy Guevara, but seriously, we're still thinking this immature dipshit is actually going to amount to anything in the business in the next 3 to 5 years? If he's still wrestling in the next 3 to 5 years, I'll be shocked. All the stupid, reckless shit that guy does in the ring, give me a break. I mean, I watched the match. It was, nah. Danielson's matches at this point are starting to blend together because I'm getting the sense that he's kind of just going through the motions a lot of the time. He showed a little bit more fire at the end here when he was yelling that he was going to kick Sammy's head in. And now a year ago when he was doing that, I would have probably popped for it because I love the idea of Danielson kicking dudes' heads in as a malicious heel. Now the bloom's kind of off the rose, so it's like, okay, he's going to kick people's heads in. And then what? Do another job to Chris Jericho for the Ring of Honor title? Danielson going over was obviously the right call. I don't know what it's setting up unless they're going to go back to the well with another Jericho-Danielson match, which I don't really want to see. I'm sorry if it feels like I'm being overly critical, but I'm just giving you an honest analysis of where I am with Bryan Danielson at this stage. They've wasted him for almost an entire year creatively when they could have gotten so much more mileage out of him. As soon as they didn't put the world title on him back in January, I immediately knew it was all downhill from there. And now here we are in October, almost November, not only is Danielson totally worthless in the grand scheme of things, but look at all those missed opportunities, all those title matches they could have done with him. Big money programs that they completely shit the bed on. Danielson versus Punk, Danielson versus Kingston when that program was still hot. Danielson versus Miro could have been great. They could have done stuff with him and FTR if Tony would have kept those guys consistently pushed. You could have eventually done something really intriguing with him and MJF if you wanted to eventually flip Danielson back babyface and go that route. I'm just thinking of all those big money programs they could have done with him. I mean, I hate to say it, but even doing another match with him and Omega when he came back. I'm not the biggest fan of Omega. We all know that. I'll admit, that match they had a year or so ago, that was probably one of the best Kenny Omega matches I've ever seen. They never really went back to the well with that program. And then they try to book Danielson and all this hot garbage with Chris Jericho and his posse of douchebags, and look where it got him. Injured, out of action. Then he came back and did a job to Daniel Garcia, and now he's toiling around in mid-card obscurity, playing second fiddle to the oil mechanic most weeks. It's a fucking criminal. And I just spilled water all over myself. Well, on that bleak note, that took us to hour 2, where I realized that the only thing left on the show in terms of matches was a girls' match involving Riho and the main event title match of Moxley and one of the Lucha fucks, neither of which I had any interest in seeing, so I skipped over almost the entirety of the second hour. There was a weird skit in the back with Eddie Kingston that I couldn't figure out for the life of me. He was pretending to put on a happy face, even though he was pissed off about something. Ended with him telling people to basically fuck off and leave him alone. Gladly. And then obviously there was the Moxley Penta title match, which I didn't watch, because why would I? It's John Moxley versus Pentagon Jr. I know what kind of match it's going to be. You know what kind of match it's going to be. It's going to be every nonsensical Moxley match where he'll do a bunch of floor brawling, biting, maybe he'll bleed, he'll make a lot of goofy facials and overselling, and it'll suck. And minus the blood, I think most of that was probably accurate. Penta was also in it, and that guy couldn't have a remotely watchable match if Bill Watts was booking him. I mean, his shit always looks horrendous, and I'm not going to subject myself to having to put up with it. And we obviously covered the aftermath where the firm laid out Moxley and MJF, the two top guys headlining their upcoming pay-per-view for the world title, and they both got laid out by a bunch of underneath schlubs. Great call, Tony. Mr. Booker of the Year. That was quite the ballsy move, if I do say so myself. And of course, the idea is to get people to think that MJF is going to be a babyface, when in actuality, it's probably all a ploy so that we can see Regal end up aligning with him, which, okay, I'm still for that being done. Hopefully the firm stuff goes away, because whatever the initial plan was when they involved MJF in that whole thing, Stokely doing his dirty bidding, it's not working. The all-out thing where they helped MJF win the poker chip, that was already a sketchy angle to begin with because it was such a flat finish to the ladder match. Plus, when you factor in the guys in the group outside the guns, I mean, they're all completely worthless, let's be honest. Morrissey's just another big lunkhead that can't really do much in the ring. Ethan Page has been wasted potential since he signed with the company. The Lee with the green hair, I still can't remember if he's Lee Moriarty or Lee Johnson, and either way, it doesn't matter. And Austin and Colton are great, but, they literally just got done shooting an angle where they were beating up FTR earlier on, and then later on in the same show, they're out here doing stuff with Stokely and the rest of the group. I don't know, they just kind of felt out of place with the whole thing. It's another one of those faction deals where it's a bunch of guys put together. Do you really buy that any of these five actually hang out with each other after the show or would be friends in any capacity? I just don't see it. And now we're approximately, I think 3 weeks out from the Full Gear pay-per-view. So far, we have one officially announced match and a bunch of speculative stuff. I don't know, maybe they ought to spend some time putting a card together, because 3 weeks to build for a pay-per-view ain't that much time if you really think about it. So we have some Crash TV chaos to kick off our program this week. Stop me if you've heard me ever talk about this before. Dudes getting jumped in the parking lot. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't seen anything like that occur in recent memory. At least not within the last 2 weeks. Now, of course, back in the year 1986, when stuff like this was actually a rarity and only happened maybe once every 3 or 4 months instead of once every 3 or 4 minutes like it does in today's business, it actually had a bigger impact and significance. And in this instance, we had the Horsemen in hot pursuit of Dusty, and I think they were all arriving at the studio from earlier in the day. And of course, the Horsemen drive up behind Dusty's car and wait to trap him in the parking lot so they can all get out and start putting the boots to him. Tully was obviously the one filming with the handheld camera because Ole and Arn and JJ were in the shot. And, again, with modern eyes, you kind of get numb to this stuff because you see it virtually every week in modern wrestling. And most of the time, they're angles that have absolutely no follow-up at all because they just move on with the rest of the show like, oh, well, guess that motherfucker's dead. Anyway, on to our scheduled match for the evening. And ironically enough, that's almost how Tony and David started the show, because they show that clip in the cold open before they even go to the booth. And of course, the announcers are just welcoming everyone to the show like it's another day in the neighborhood. Nothing to see here, folks. Not like we just saw a hit job less than 3 seconds prior. No, they're just peachy to be there. But there were more important things to attend to at the moment, including the update on Magnum TA's car accident, which we've been covering for the last few episodes, how shortly all of this was coming up. They announce here that they'll have a full update later on in the program to talk about the incident and fill everyone in with the details. That, in addition to a Starrcade card update, which is probably understating it, that was more of a case of complete renovation. All the changes that went into that last minute. It's amazing how they were still able to pull everything off on such a short notice, too. But we turned things over to Brad Armstrong, who came out for a quick promo. And he basically talked about how 2 years ago, he was on the sidelines getting to experience Starrcade firsthand. But now he is jumping in with both feet, just wanting the opportunity to wrestle on the card. Says he has not signed any contracts yet, but he's looking forward to anything that lies ahead. Very humbling man that Brad Armstrong was. And then we went to the ring for Brad Armstrong and Tim Horner going up against Bill Tabb and Brody Chase. It's funny, I kind of talked a little bit about how much of a chick magnet Brad was when he was first coming up in the business. You don't believe me? Go watch some of his Mid-South tapes from '84. God, that guy was over with the ladies. He was getting the Rock and Roll Express and the Fantastics a good run for their money at one point. And it carried over here in '86 in Atlanta with the studio crowd. Overall, a fun match. Horner and Armstrong were a real solid pairing. Good underneath babyface team. Obviously not on the same level as someone like the Rock and Roll Express or the Fantastics, like we mentioned a minute ago, but one of those high-energy babyface teams with two young boys that were just trying to break the ice in the business. I like the kid during this match that was trying to give the job guys advice. Whenever Brody or Bill were being worked over on the mat, there was a kid in the crowd, couldn't have been any older than 7 or 8 years old, and he was trying to advise the job guys to get the ropes whenever they were in jeopardy. There's a deal where Brody gets tagged in for the first time after Bill was getting worked over, and the kid goes, "Next time, if he gets you down, grab the ropes." Solid advice. That young chap had a strong mind for the business. Maybe it was a young MJF. Actually, it couldn't have been MJF because he's only 25 years old, right? Yeah, he wouldn't have been born until 96. Yeah, I can do math. That good old Scott Steiner math. Anyway, Horner got the win by hitting Brody with the Russian leg sweep. That was followed with a complete whacked out of his mind Jimmy Valiant promo. Doing every incomprehensible handsome Jimmy promo you've ever heard on the Superstation. And it was equally as great. Talking about how Big Mama is putting her luscious red locks on the line against Paul Jones at Starrcade. If Jones can somehow defeat the Boogeyman. But Boogeyman's still betting on being the one to make Paul Jones the bald-headed geek. Then he had Tony read his t-shirt on air, and it read, and I quote, "Paul Jones, the Boogeyman will get you." So now we know where the other Boogeyman stole his catchphrase from. Gorgeous Jimmy Garvin wrestled John Savage. Not a close relative to the Macho Man, I presume. And, well, Savage was beaten here. He was savagely beaten. Garvin even kept his glistening silver pants on for this one. That is how confident he was. But on to more important things. They brought out Jim Crockett Jr. to provide an update on the condition of Magnum TA. You know, and I'm pretty sure most people have heard or read the story by now. You know, this is probably one of the more notable wrestling stories of 1986 period. You know, unfortunately, not for reasons that you want to remember for being good. You know, you've heard people speak about it over the years, too. I mean, everyone from wrestling journalists to the boys in the business. It made local headlines at the time for the newspaper, and that's how significant this story was. I mean, they even have still images of the car and what it looked like after the whole accident. But it was October of 86. Mid-October. God, I'm making it sound like I'm telling a round table story to a bunch of 8-year-olds. It was a dark and stormy night in mid-October of 1986. No, but in all seriousness, for anybody that has not heard the story, I'll try to give you a brief Cliff's Notes version of it. So Magnum TA was driving his car down the highway in Charlotte. I believe this was only several miles from his home, too. And he had been leaving his house at the time, so he didn't even make it all that far before everything went down. But there was a terrible rainstorm that same night, so he wound up veering off the road in his car, and he ran into a telephone pole, completely totaled the car. Again, if you've never seen still images of what it looked like in the paper, just go search it on Google Images. I mean, it's insane. And I believe the medical report showed that he had suffered a wrecked C4 and C5 vertebrae. And, you know, this is a well-known and documented story at this point, but the injury ended up ending his career entirely. Just like that, it was all over. He was paralyzed on one side of his body for months after the fact. But the amazing thing is that the doctors reported years later that because of Magnum's conditioning and how physically in shape he was, that was probably what ended up saving his life. You know, all that muscle density and bone structure, and because the guy was in such phenomenal shape, his body was able to repair certain damage and protect him from essentially a life-ending injury. You know, had he been out of shape, who knows what would have happened. And, you know, we've been talking on the reports here about how they had to basically restructure the entire Starrcade card, and I don't know what the initial plan was for Magnum at the event. You know, seeing how this was literally weeks out from the show and when this all happened, I believe the idea was still for Magnum to win back the United States title from Nikita Koloff and then kind of prep him for that world title run sometime in 87. And this ended up shifting all kinds of booking decisions, up to and including Nikita's face turn, which, well, stay tuned for that in a moment. You know, obviously the actual incident was a year before I was born, so the only context I have to it is reading up on the stories and listening to interviews from guys that were around during this period talk about it. I didn't experience this live as a fan at the time, and even if I did, I probably would have only found out the details through whatever they presented on the television show. I didn't read articles or news magazines as a kid all that much, and there was certainly no internet. So all the information that they presented on this, I think this was all based on whatever detail they provided on the weekly TV shows. Things were obviously bleak around this time here because there was so much uncertainty with what Magnum's future was in the pro wrestling industry. Instinctually, I think everyone probably knew in the back of their minds that this was the end of Magnum's in-ring career. I don't think a whole lot of people ever thought the guy would ever walk again, much less wrestle or get physical. But, he'd obviously make his return about a year later when Dusty and Nikita won the Crockett Cup and came out to embrace both guys, and that was a memorable moment. And one that I am looking forward to talking about, because it's not all that far off from where we are now if you really think about it. But for where we are now in the timeline, it's a lot of open-ended discussion, lots of questions, lots of uncertainty, but, everyone's obviously trying to stay positive and hope for the best because they talked about how this is going to be a long road to recovery, and it certainly was. For the record, I think there's an interview out there with Magnum himself actually talking about everything in detail. I think it's that Hannibal guy that interviewed him. I know he gets a bad reputation, but I think that's really one of the only documented instances where Magnum is actually really covering everything in detail. So I guess if you want more reference, Magnum is actually on YouTube talking about everything. It's a tough story to break down, but, the great thing about looking at it through the lens of 2022, we know that even though Magnum never wrestled again after this point, his actual career technically didn't end from here. Because he would obviously do commentary years later, made sporadic appearances after the fact, including Smoky Mountain in 95, which I think is one of my earliest memories of actually seeing Magnum as a kid growing up. It's one of those details where they only really scratched the surface of what went down here, but there was clearly a lot of what they didn't know at the time. So even though this was taped several weeks out from it, they didn't automatically throw out every detail of Magnum's recovery when, honestly, I'm not even sure they knew at the time. So we'll keep posted with Magnum's health updates as we chug along through these reviews. In the meantime, it is time for a Starrcade card update. At the Starrcade Control Center, we've now got an update on the condition of the Road Warriors after the heinous attack from the Midnight Express weeks back on the Superstation, where that slimeball Jim Cornette clocked Animal in the back of the head with his loaded racket and put him on the shelf. So they showed us some training footage with Hawk and Animal picking up a lot of heavy shit and doing things that I can only dream of ever doing in the gym. At least when it comes to weights and whatever they were pressing, it was more than I weigh. I can guarantee you that. I also enjoyed the shot here where Hawk was helping Animal with his deadlift, and by doing so, apparently clubbing Animal in the back several times with stiff elbows. That was apparently going to do the job. But as we all know, this Road Warriors Midnight Express match from Starrcade 86, it was no ordinary tag match. It was, in fact, the Night of the Skywalkers, the legendary Scaffold Match, because the Midnights try to put Animal out of commission and end his career. And now those boys done fucked up. Because now the Legion of Doom are the ones that are going to be looking to put the Midnights out of commission for good. And in case your stomach didn't already drop to the floor with the idea of looking at a giant construction scaffold, we got to see Animal, Hawk, and Ellering actually climb up the scaffold and throw pumpkins off of the platform to apparently demonstrate what Ian and Condrey's heads were going to look like once they get tossed off. That was how they built this. And they do the overly dramatic slow-mo of Hawk throwing the two pumpkins off the platform and seeing the giant splat after they all smash to the concrete. It was wacky, but it was a legendary match. It was the first scaffold match the NWA ever hosted, at least to my recollection. Obviously they had done these kinds of matches before, but I think this was the first one that the NWA hosted. If they did beforehand, you can admonish me in the comment section, but I don't know. Anyway, this is probably also the only good scaffold match I ever remember seeing. One of those instances in wrestling of often imitated, never duplicated. Should have left it at a one-and-done thing, but unfortunately, they would try this gimmick match over and over again throughout history, and, well, the rest is history, so to speak. In addition, we've also got an update on the Paul Jones-Jimmy Valiant match. Speaking of guys being in the air, the Raging Bull will also be in a shark cage at ringside, suspended 30 feet above the ring. Because what could possibly go wrong when you put a heel in a shark cage above the ring during a match to prevent interference? And finally, to cap it off, at least for now, Tully Blanchard and Dusty Rhodes will be having a non-sanctioned First Blood match for the World's Television Championship. And because the NWA is not sanctioning the match, Jim Crockett Jr. will see it that he takes the contract to Dusty personally to get his stamp of approval. So it's a 3-match card as we speak right now, and it already looks 10 times better than anything I'm going to probably see on that Full Gear pay-per-view. So then we came back from break with one of the most hilarious David Crockett moments I've ever seen. He is stoked about this scaffold match gimmick. The idea of seeing someone fall from 30 feet in the air and possibly break their neck, or any other bone in their body for that matter, David cannot wait to see that. Why'd I tell you, Tony? 30 feet in the air. A scaffold match, where the only way to win is to throw your opponent off the platform and send them plummeting to earth. Someone's gonna die, Tony. Isn't that just great? I love David so much. He's the fucking best. I'm such a mark for him. Speaking of loving things, this hit job angle with Dusty and the Horsemen. Well, this was just classic pro wrestling heat. So they show the full footage of the Horsemen following Dusty in his car into the parking lot. Now they said Crockett's office here. So looking back, maybe it wasn't the studio they were driving to. In any case, the Horsemen ended up gangbanging Dusty, in the hypothetical sense. They wind up tying Dusty to one of the work trucks with the ladder attached on the side. And while he's strung up, JJ's there choking Dusty with a baseball bat. And it ends up with Ole giving Dusty several bat shots to the exposed hand, which they comically blur on camera so that we can't actually see it. Apparently that would not pass the sniff test on TBS back in the day to show a guy's warped, mangled hand on broadcast TV. But, was scrolled too far down in my notes here. Well, the long and short of it is they leave Dusty tied up in sort of a crucifix position, and they tell him, "We'll see you tomorrow in Charlotte, Rhodes." Poor Dusty. But it's standard pro wrestling heat. A great mugging angle with a bunch of no-good dirtbag dogs jumping a babyface behind his back and leaving his hand broken and battered. Dusty's there completely helpless with no one in sight to help him. By the way, where the hell was Jim Crockett Jr.'s office supposed to be? Because, this was filmed in, a back alley somewhere. I didn't know Atlanta was that sketchy of an area. And here's the great thing about this particular angle, too. Unlike in today's business, where there will be a stationary cameraman there to film the incident and not do a damn thing about it, here they had Tully carrying around the handheld camera so that we, the viewers, could actually buy that the Horsemen and Dusty were the only 5 that were part of this. Not the douchebag camera guy filming the jump attack and then he just stands there to film the babyface while he's crying out in pain. Subtle detail, I know, but I noticed it. So take that for what it's worth. And that took us to another legendary TV moment on the Superstation. The unlikely alliance formation that nobody saw coming. And God, what a moment this was. As we come to find out, Dusty was scheduled for a tag match with the Horsemen the following night in Charlotte, and he said that he'd be there to fight, and he was coming with a partner that no one else would have ever expected. But when it happened, boy, did it get over like wildfire. Because who should come out with Dusty for this tag match? But of all people, Nikita Koloff. And they shot this so well because you got Dusty storming down the aisleway to the cage and Nikita's following behind, but he's still kind of tentative about the whole thing. And when Dusty gets into the cage and Ole and JJ immediately start targeting Nikita, you got Nikita climbing into the cage. He's pretty slow. He's thinking about it for a minute. But then he snaps into babyface mode and he does the right thing. And he takes the fight to Ole and JJ. And of course, the crowd seeing Nikita help out Dusty and go after the Horsemen, everyone fucking lit the house ablaze over that. People leaping to their feet, babies being thrown into the air, the whole 9 yards. And after Nikita throws Ole out of the cage to prevent him from running back in, that is when Dusty drives his cast into JJ's head and pins him. And while the Horsemen are carrying out JJ's dead body, Ric Flair's in the crowd doing the promo on Nikita, telling him he's got a date with destiny. Flair was so good at the facials, but when he's trying to be overly confident and smug, telling Nikita that he's basically getting in the ring with God, and Nikita climbs up on the turnbuckle and lets out a huge roar, and they put the camera back on Flair in the crowd, and now he's unsure of himself. Because he sees Nikita and he sees the fire in that man's eyes. And now he's like, all right, maybe that wasn't such a good idea trying to poke the bear. And he's still trying to stay self-assured. But, man, you look at Flair during this little interaction with Nikita, you could smell the fear. He was so good at giving off those vibes, man. Ric Flair. The art of subtlety. If you're a young guy in the business today that wants to learn how to be an effective bad guy, go watch Ric Flair. I know this is a groundbreaking story in 2022. Watch Ric Flair. He was very good. No one would have ever seen that coming. And things just kind of tie in with transitions on the show, because now we have a sit-down with Nikita and Dusty, where they kind of explain how this new superpower group came to be, breaking down everything from the beginning by saying that after everything that happened to Magnum, Nikita and Dusty had talked on a couple occasions to hash things out, and while they don't agree on everything, and they don't see eye to eye, they have one common bond at the moment. And from Dusty's point of view, whether the people are for or against him, it's not important for the circumstances of where they are right now. And Nikita's saying that he's proud to be a Russian, and he is superior athlete. But when he heard about what happened with Magnum, he called Dusty personally, because he remembers the hard fights that he had in the ring with Magnum, and over the multiple bouts they've had, Nikita grew to respect Magnum as an athlete. Basically says that he now has a cause to team with Dusty, because Magnum is that one common bond that both men share. They value Magnum as a wrestler and a talent, and Nikita will continue to do what he does best, but with the idea in mind that it is to live up to Magnum's talent. It's good shit, man. What else can you say? It's not Nikita completely retconning his entire backstory and leaving his Russian morals and values behind him. He and Dusty are not best friends. They're not chummy. They probably wouldn't go out and share a beer together on most occasion. But they can tolerate one another, and they can agree to work on each other's behalf for Magnum. And while it's certainly an American value to stand by your fallen heroes, It is also the value of Russian countrymen to do the same. You may not agree with what they stand for politically, but you can certainly admire that they care for their fellow countrymen, and they would take a bullet for them. You know, obviously, as we know throughout history, the Dusty Nikita pairing would become more than just a short-term placeholder duo, especially by the year 87. But for where we are right now at this time in the story, this is a great introductory. You know, they're warming up to each other and not immediately diving headfirst into Nikita being the anti-Russian, pro-American babyface. I guess it's what the Marks would call a tweener role, where, you know, he's towing the line, he's not officially jumping from one side to the other, he's still on the fence, but you can kind of see the direction he's going to lean eventually. Even though I hate the term tweener, but it's kind of what we're looking at. But it leaves a little breathing room for story development, and that's what you want with this. So then we went to Ole and Arn versus Randy Barber and Clement Fields, or as Tony Schiavone mentioned here, Ole Anderson beating up on someone. Gotta love when even the announcers didn't know who the job guys were. Anyway, they pounded on Fields for a couple minutes and ended up submitting him with an armbar. Barber, I believe, just stood on the apron like a dolt and watched. Good payday for him. Didn't have to get his ass beat for it. That was followed with Jimmy Cornette in a fitting rage over the whole scaffold deal. He basically ranted and raved for over a full minute about how dangerous the scaffold match is and how irrational a human would have to be to come up with a stipulation like that. And Corny is convinced that it is a conspiracy theory from everyone in NWA management to try and put one over on the Midnights and end their wrestling career for good. And, that was about all there was to it. One of those cases where Cornette was talking way too fast for me to keep track of, and I don't know, I just started writing words down, but I think I got the gist of it. And our TV main event, Manny Fernandez and Rick Rude versus Kent Glover and Alan Martin, wherein one of the very first spots in this match is Bull driving one of the job guys into Rude's tricep on the apron, and apparently that was enough to knock the guy out cold. I don't think I've ever seen that done in the history of wrestling, and I think Rick Rude is the only guy that you could pull that spot off with and not make it look hokey. Aside from that, Rude killed the other job guy with a Rude Awakening DDT, and then he flexed to the camera. That's never not funny, by the way. By the way, didn't they name Robert Roode's DDT in WWE the Rude Awakening too? I know he was doing a ravishing Rick Rude gimmick at one point, but, well, actually, now that I think about it, I don't even know the last time I saw Robert Roode on TV. Where the hell is that guy at? Is he injured? I'd like to know. And our show closing promo was Paul Jones, basically informing us that his new and improved army is about big money ball players. Tells Baron von Raschke that he was too worn down and fragile to keep up with the new direction he wanted to go, so he can go piss up a rope sideways for all he cares. He also fired off some shots at the Rock and Roll Express and Wahoo McDaniel, said that Manny and Rude would be they will be world tag team champions before not too long. Certainly wasn't lying about that. And then he promised that Jimmy Valiant and Big Mama would be bald-headed geeks after Starrcade. Also had Bull and Rude throwing in some dialogue here. I particularly liked Rude's promo where he told Wahoo that he lasted 9 years in the NFL, but he couldn't last 9 seconds before getting punked out by him and Bull. And then he said, "Better a red man than a dead man." Direct quote. Yeah, I don't think that would pass on the network television these days. And, well, they tried to keep ranting afterwards, otherwise they would have gone on for 9 hours, but Tony actually had to cut them off. That was funny. Goddamn, what a great television show, though. The Magnum story is always a tragic thing when you have to bring it up. And I mean, we are at that point in history where you kind of have to mention it. But the way they handled everything else, again, it's almost amazing when you think about it. All those last-minute changes that had to go into that Starrcade card, and they jumped on it like it was nothing. Just like, well, we'll swap a couple things around here, but it all made sense. There was logic to everything that was done. I have no qualms with it. The last-minute Nikita face turn, God, it got him over with the crowd almost instantly. The stuff with the Horseman and Dusty was well done. Obviously, the announcement of the Scaffold Match with the Road Warriors and the Midnights, that was well done. When you look back at it, this is probably an all-time studio show for that reason alone. And obviously I'm not the guy that's going to be able to break down every single one of these stories by detail and talk about it for 45 minutes straight. The experts know more than I do, especially the ones that were around during the time. But if you're a wrestling historian or you're just looking for shows and sources to kind of learn about the peak years in the business and all-time great storylines and classics, watch this episode of World Championship Wrestling from October 25th, 1986. I mean, you're pretty much going to get the full Starrcade context here. Everything that led up to the event on this episode, it's all in one sitting. At least with the prime material that mattered. The main draws of the show. But we will move on with things. World Class Championship Wrestling from October 29th, 1983. And we begin our program this week with not a replay, but an encore of a previous six-man tag bout. So in other words, a replay. I guess the word encore was supposed to sell it better to the viewers at home. Don't change that dial. Even though you may have already seen this match at one point, you're not going to want to miss it again. That is what we may call clever programming tactics. Anyway, the match, I believe, was Chris Adams, the Iceman, and David Von Erich versus Michael Hayes, the Mongol, and Kamala. And factoring in this was apparently taped at the Will Rogers Coliseum in Dallas, as opposed to the Sportatorium, I don't think we've ever actually talked about this match. At least I don't think we did. It did not look familiar on first sighting, partially because I don't think I recall ever seeing anyone from the Freebirds team up with Devastation Inc. The match was also in progress, being called by Mark Lorenz, who I also do not believe we have ever heard call ring action before in World Class. Most of the time it was Bill Mercer flying solo. So this is kind of funny because the whole story of the match was centered around the fact that Kamala did not understand the rules of tag team wrestling. So they'd be doing spots like Hayes tagging in Kamala by slapping him hard on the wrist. And of course, Kamala interprets that as Hayes trying to be an enemy of his. So he's going after Hayes while Skandar Akbar is trying to talk to him and run down the rules of everything. And then a few seconds later, Kamala grabs Hayes' hand for kind of sort of a tag. And then when Hayes comes back in the ring, Kamala's still trying to work over one of the baby faces, so he gets all pissed at Michael Hayes for trying to come into the ring. And of course, all this makes sense with Kamala's gimmick around this time. Not the fact that he was a bumbling fool, but based on the fact that Kamala's matches have mostly consisted of him just going in there and smashing dudes in 30 seconds. So when you put him in a tag situation, he's got no clue what the fuck's going on half the time. It was simultaneously comical when you think about the fact that they're playing up the story with Kamala for a good portion of the clip they showed here, yet somehow during all of that, the babyfaces were all completely incapable of gaining control of the match. Just like, way to make your babyfaces look like morons. Of course, I mean that facetiously. And they eventually get to the 10-minute part of this match where David locks in the claw on Kamala for what seemingly felt like a half hour. Ironically enough, during the part where Kamala tried to leave because he was too afraid to get back in the ring with David, Lorenz casually says under his breath, "Feels like this match has been going on for an hour." I believe that was coded language for, "This match is boring as fuck." And I mean, I'm not going to lie, they didn't show the full match, but that is probably how I would describe most of what I saw here. And this stalling period with Kamala and David went on for, I think I counted somewhere in the range of 3 to 4 minutes. Literally, there's almost a 5-minute period here where nothing happens except for Kamala standing on the apron and refusing to get into the ring with David. And even Mark Lorenz is commenting how we're all waiting. Any time now. Maybe. Possibly before the next Ice Age. Meanwhile, through all of this, the babyfaces were still completely incapable to gain offensive control. And finally, after about 8 yawns, 5 coffee breaks, and impatiently twiddling my thumbs waiting for something of note to happen, Chris Adams got a hot tag, ran wild. There was a part at the end where everyone ran into the ring and got in each other's way. Kamala continued to stand on the apron and do nothing, and then Adams somehow pinned Mongol with a super kick. Clusterfuck. That is what I wrote down in my notes here. I don't know. I mean, the Kamala story was kind of a cute idea on paper, but when you take into account that it also led to large portions where nobody was doing anything except watching Kamala cower in fear, it got pretty boring, not going to lie. People still went crazy for it, because this was 1983 when the fans went crazy for just about everything. I think David Von Erich could have dropped his pants and taken a massive shit in the middle of the ring during this match. People still would have popped for it. Me, on the other hand, I almost fell asleep watching this match. I was also watching this after a 12-hour workday where I was running around nonstop, so maybe I was tired, but there you have it. So after taking a few minutes to collect myself, I came back for this gorgeous Jimmy Garvin versus Masked Avenger match. And who was the Masked Avenger in World Class? Well, whoever it was, Jimmy Garvin made sure to point out how much of a goof he looked like. If I weren't a smart man who followed story continuity, I probably would have assumed it was an ordinary job guy from the Dallas region. But if you've been paying close attention to Garvin's ongoing story with the American Heavyweight title, there is a man that's been calling him out on television almost every week for a match, and Garvin's been avoiding him like the plague. So, one might say that this man has been plotting to get in the ring with Gorgeous Jimmy somehow. And this was an absolute perfectly done storytelling angle. Super old school, but they got the job done. Because they got Garvin blowing him off at the beginning. He's doing push-ups, mocking the poor masked man, doing everything to make a mockery of the situation. And of course, as soon as they ring the bell for the match, the Masked Avenger begins out-wrestling and throwing Garvin all over the ring. And they get to the spot where Garvin gets whipped off the ropes, and the masked man catches him with a super kick. 1, 2, 3. And who should reveal himself under the hood but good old gentleman Chris Adams himself. The man that's been calling out Gorgeous Jimmy on TV for weeks now, and he keeps blowing him off at every turn. No, and of course, when he takes the mask off, everyone blows their lid over it. And it is important to note that this was not an officially recognized title match, so technically Garvin still keeps the belt for the time being, but the fact that Adams now has a visual pin over the champion, that should be enough to grant him a future title match with Garvin. All well done. And of course, the reveal of Adams under the hood sent everyone into a frenzy. You know, and I like the brief follow-up with Chris Adams after the match saying, "Garvin, you've been ducking me for weeks now. I wanted you in the ring. You kept running away. And now that I got you in the ring and I beat you, now there's no running or hiding. Next time, it's going to be Garvin versus Adams for the American Heavyweight title. No masks, no tricks, no BS." You know, it's almost like this is a really well-done wrestling angle that made sense and would actually work in today's business if done correctly. Maybe Tony Khan ought to watch some world-class tapes to get an idea. instead of putting his stock in the hands of Chris Jericho to come up with shit. Especially when all his ideas suck. Then we had a Michael Hayes Jose Lothario match, which had another interesting little angle attached to it. It started with Black Gordman confronting Lothario in the ring, completely at random with no explanation, and challenging Lothario to a fight in Spanish. By the way, I knew absolutely nothing about Black Gordman prior to seeing him here. Obviously, he was a big star in Mexico, but in addition to my Mexican wrestling knowledge being mid at best, Gordman was also primarily active in the 70s, which was still a little before my time, so not all that familiar. I've heard the name before, but, you told me to go back and point out a Black Gordman match that stood out. I probably would shrug my shoulders at it. But he attacked Lothario and ended up injuring his shoulders here. Or injuring one shoulder, I should say. And that allowed for Hayes to work that over for most of the match. And he ended up going over in the end. But they played up the injury as the deciding factor because Lothario really didn't put up much of a fight to begin with. Fine little heat angle. Again, my viewing of this feud is going to be purely based on what they show on the Dallas TV shows. I don't know how long Gordman sticks around with Lothario to feud with him, but guess we'll see. But that took us to the main event, Terry Gordy versus Kevin Von Erich. And stop me if you heard me say this. It was every Freebirds versus Von Erich match circa 1983. Good match. Kevin was a great babyface in peril. He worked over Gordy for a while, out-wrestled and outmaneuvered him at almost every turn. They played up the story where Kevin had Terry trapped in a leg scissors on the mat. They actually had this great spot where Gordy tried to run off the ropes while Kevin was lying on the mat. And every time Gordy would run to another side of the ring, Kevin kept turning his body over to try and catch Gordy in the hold again. And finally, it ended up with Gordy stumbling and then falling back into the scissor lock again. It's kind of hokey looking, but I laughed at it. We also had our first on-screen mention of Mike Von Erich during this match, who Mercer said will be making his TV debut very soon. The Lost Boy Von Erich, as I've commonly referred to him as over the years. It's funny, and I thought about this too a lot during these world-class reviews. We get so caught up in talking about Kevin and Kerry and David. Michael Von Erich always seems to flow by the wayside when it comes to the discussion of the family. But it's not to try to exclude him from the conversation because he is going to be mentioned here, but we'll be talking about him more in weeks to come. But Gordy was able to work over Kevin for a little while, tried to get him on the mat so he could soften him up for the Oriental Spike. He was able to temporarily lock it in on the apron, but he ended up having to break the hold to avoid being DQ'd. And then finally, both guys went back and forth at the end, and Gordy initially ended up rolling through for a pinfall, and he went over on Kevin using the tights. However, Bronco Lubitsch was also present while the match was in progress, and he had seen Gordy use the tights. So in this instance, David Manning reverses the decision and grants Kevin the winner because he took Bronco's word for it. Which is kind of funny because we're so accustomed to modern wrestling where the heels fucks over the babyface, and we all just kind of shrug and go, oh, that's unfortunate. Well, maybe he'll get him next time. Not here. No, it was very important, apparently, that this match had a clean, decisive winner. These refs were not going to let the Freebirds pull a fast one over on the Von Erichs this time. And that evidently led to a post-match brawl between the two where Kevin was able to run off Gordy. Part of me wonders if they did the reverse decision to ensure the fans didn't go home pissed off. I don't know, maybe it was like a taping thing where they did this last and they didn't want to send the fans home pissed off by putting the heel over on the last set of tapings. Especially when it's the Von Erichs we're talking about here. God, could you imagine if Gordy would have gone over Kevin without a reverse decision? Those people would have started a freaking riot. Anyway, well, that was the main event. Like I said before, Freebirds and Von Erichs matches. They're good. They're always good. But we've also reviewed, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of 1,847 of those matches by now. It's not to soften the blow. I just don't think there's anything left to say about the actual matches unless there's an angle or something afterwards that ties in with the match. You know, they're always going to be good matches, but we reviewed so many of them by now. It's like, what else is there to really say about it? It's like a Brock Lesnar-Roman Reigns match. You see it again, and again, and again, and again, and eventually you're fed up with it and say, okay, how about we change things up a bit? All in all, though, that was a strong episode, too. The opening six-man was kind of dull and dragged on for a while. But, you know, they had a central story going on to further the Kamala David Von Erich program with Devastation Inc. I love the Chris Adams, Jimmy Garvin angle. And they're continuing to establish the new side of Gordy's heel persona with the Oriental Spike gimmick. You know, I love the way they've adapted his ring style and have made him a more intimidating, unhinged force. It's all great stuff. Lots of angle advancement, good ring action. Another world-class episode that flew by. Anyway, so I think that'll about wrap things up for this episode. Again, thank you for stopping in if this is your first time checking out the 5 Starr Wrestling Report. We will be back this coming Monday. Don't think anything's going on this weekend in terms of events. I believe the Crown Jewel show is next weekend. Still haven't made up my mind whether or not I'm going to watch that show. I mean, unless I'm really looking forward to watching a train wreck of Omos versus Brodie the Strowman. That could actually be entertaining. But as far as an actual card and trying to invest 3 hours into it, I don't know about all that. I'll have to see what my workload looks like. It's been a pretty hectic few weeks for me lately. It might be one of those things where I'll check out the highlights if there's something worth talking about on the card and maybe tie it in with the Monday report, but I don't know if I'm going to spend copious amounts of time talking about it or treat it like a full review from top to bottom. But we will see. I'll stay cautiously optimistic, I guess. But until then, thanks for watching. Take care, all. Peace out. And fuck people that are mowing their lawns.